Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Dr. Bill Campbell, back on, I think for the fourth time. So we're getting up there. But every time Dr. Campbell comes on, it's always a great episode and a ton of great information. So looking forward to chatting with you again.
Yeah, thank you for having me on again. I appreciate it.
Every time I have a guest come back on, I always kind of look to see the last time we chatted. It was August, I think, around, that's when the episode released. So probably like late July, early August, we chatted. So, it's been, 9 months, 8 to 9 months now. So I guess on your end, we were just chatting off air. You just wrapped up the semester. Now you have a nice little class you have to do in 4 weeks. What does any summer plans or anything like that for you? Or what does it kind of look like for you in the summer?
So professionally, I'm going to attend two conferences, the International Society of Sports Nutrition Conference. That's in June. That's right here in Florida, in Fort Lauderdale. And in July, I'm going to the National Strength and Conditioning Conference. That's in Las Vegas. And we're presenting some of the research that we've done over this past year. And I love both of those conferences. I don't travel a lot. Actually, I don't travel much at all. So when I get to go to these conferences, I love it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So funny you say that. I wanted to go to ISSN. I haven't been able to make it the last couple of years, but I can't make it that weekend, but I am going to the NSCA National Conference. Actually just got my flight and everything the other night. So I'm looking forward to that. Are you doing any speaking there or?
No, I have one of my students is presenting one of our abstract studies. So I'll be attending that, but no, I'm not speaking. So that's good. We can meet in person. Have you been there before?
So I did the coaches conference back in I think it was 2020 actually. So like a couple months before the pandemic started. And then I haven't been able to go to the national conference that they have in the summer. So I'm looking forward to it. I know the coaches conference was a little bit of a smaller one, but had a ton of great stuff there. And I was already looking up the topics and I'm already like, man, I don't know how I'm going to be able to swing all these. So there's a lot of good topics and whatnot as well too. So
yes. Yeah, I love that. It's a good conference when you're torn, like, what am I going to see? That's one thing I'll say about ISSN. They don't have competing talks. They used to, but now they have one track. So you don't have the dilemma. Although I guess you have the dilemma of if you're not interested in the talk, you're kind of screwed.
Yeah. The first year I went to ISSN, I think it was in Vegas, this is actually where the NSCA is this year. They did have the two going on at the same time. And then the last time I went, they didn't have that. So I guess they kind of did away with that, which, like you said, the nice thing is you don't have to worry about which one to go to. But if you're not interested in something, then I know that it's like, well, you kind of have to listen to it. So cool. Yeah. Looking forward to that. And we'll definitely have to meet up. And so it sounds like, just going to some conferences, just kind of get to relax a little bit more. And I guess don't have to teach or anything like that over the summer or anything.
No, my teaching will be wrapped up in the end of, let's just say early June, my teaching. So yeah, 2 months of no teaching and then just kind of focusing on research for those months.
Awesome. I know last time we chatted too, I know you were thinking about doing kind of a carbohydrate study on yourself in terms of your own training and nutrition. Is that still going on? I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a very good memory. I did start that. Let me just give a little background. And I haven't necessarily made this public. I may have, obviously I mentioned it to you. I've mentioned it maybe on one or two other podcasts, but I haven't discussed it yet on any social media. So I would say I get a little frustrated with a lot of misinformation in the space, and I don't have a lot of time. I don't have any time to combat it. I let other people do that. I've got, my job really doesn't allow me to go down that rabbit hole. But one of the things that I think is doing a lot of harm to people is misinformation about what you have to do, in quotes, when you go on a diet. And one of the pervasive things that doesn't seem to be going away is that you have to cut out, eliminate, or reduce carbohydrate. And I think that sets a lot of people up for failure because they think they have to do that. And then when they can't stick to that type of diet, then they feel like a failure and then they quit dieting and they just go on continuing in an excess body fat state and most likely also having some health problems along with that. So what I'm doing is I'm basically challenging that false narrative with my own body. So I gained a lot of weight somewhat naturally. It wasn't like I set out to become obese, but I am, and probably I know I was obese. I was up to my heaviest weight ever in my life. And I had planned to go on a very high carbohydrate, high glycemic load and one could say a high insulin producing diet, which would totally counter the narrative you have to reduce carbs or you have to eliminate carbs to lose body fat. So I'm in my 10th week on this diet so far. I'm about to get my body composition measured in a couple days. So I'm getting a DEXA, bod pod, ultrasound, total body, BIA, bioelectrical impedance spectroscopy. So a lot of different assessments. And the plan is to publish this as a case study so that it can kind of sit out there in the evidence-based space. So if anybody ever is telling somebody, you have to reduce carbs, if I can succeed on this type of diet, the response could be, no, you don't. You have to focus on your calories. Now, I do want to say the way that I'm dieting is not how I would recommend that people diet. I'm doing this to make a point and to solve a different problem of misinformation, but it is not how I would advise somebody to diet because I'm eating a ton of processed foods, high carb foods, etc.
What does obviously you're going higher carbohydrate. What does that kind of macro setup look like? I'm assuming you're still probably trying to hit like some sort of protein or are you not? I'm curious to hear that.
Yeah. Ideally, yes, but in practice, no. So the goal is to get the majority of my calories from carbs, and that would be approximately 60%. And that would probably leave about 20% for protein, 20% for fat. So when we initially designed this, we had planned that I could still get 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass. But as we were experimenting, and my research team helped me plan this, my students at my university, I realized I can't even eat that much protein. By eating that much protein, it gets my carbs lower. So protein's probably, I haven't analyzed this, but it's probably closer to about a gram per kg, which is really low. A gram of protein per kilogram of body weight, which would be like what, 0.6, 0.5 grams per pound. It's low. Now, I don't think I will lose a lot of muscle mass throughout this for two reasons. One, I'm continuing to resistance train throughout the entire process. And I've set this up over a year ago. So I've set my training volume, my cardio. So the only thing that's changing is my diet. My training and cardio have not changed at all. And so for that reason, I have the same stimulus on my muscle to maintain muscle mass. And a high carbohydrate or high insulin producing diet is actually very anti-catabolic. So insulin will prevent the breakdown of muscle. So I'm generating a lot of insulin, I presume, even though I'm not testing insulin, but I'm eating the carbs that would produce insulin. So that should also prevent the loss of muscle mass. And my colleague, Dr. Sam Buckner, he's our ultrasound expert, really great scientist. He did a 9-site muscle cross-sectional area or muscle thickness measure on me over 7 or 9 different muscles. So we'll be able to see, did I lose any muscle thickness throughout this process as well, in addition to just 2-compartment model of fat-free mass and body.
Awesome. Yeah. So it sounds like you're just trying to get your carbohydrates as like high as you can to where then like you also, obviously want to make sure you hit it at least a minimum amount of fats and then obviously a minimum amount of protein as well too. So, and then that is a good point you bring up too about the carbohydrates being anti-catabolic, because I think a lot of people, overlook that aspect of carbohydrates as well. So on that topic of carbohydrates and like protein, so is that a problem that you're running into as well too, where it's like carbs are so high that you're getting a good amount of like protein from, like trace, like oatmeal or something like that will have a little bit of protein. Is that something you're accounting for? Or are you kind of separating those two out?
My main goal at the end of every day is to make sure the percentage of calories coming from carbohydrates are about 60%.
Okay.
Sometimes, I would like to get it to 65%. And a lot of the foods that I'm naturally choosing, like cookies, is a little higher in fat. So my fats are a little higher probably than what I anticipated, and my protein's a little lower. But yeah, and I also had thought that I was going to have a vegetable soup. So I designed a vegetable soup that I was going to drink every day. I don't really have the calories for that. So I'm really not, it's not a diet that I would recommend. Just give an example. Well, here, let me just pick a day last week, any day, and I'll tell you what I had.
Tuesday.
All right. So last Tuesday.
And I'm assuming too, with like, when you saying this isn't something you'd recommend, probably partly too, from like a satiety standpoint as well. I would imagine that you're not feeling, I guess that's maybe a good question too, to ask you, are you feeling, satiated, during this as well too, and things like that?
Yeah. So that's exactly right. The way that I'm doing this is the worst strategy for trying to help yourself prevent hunger. I'm not too hungry on this. And if you think about it though, and again, I haven't made it public yet. I'm making it public on your podcast. I'll soon start posting about this. But there's a lot of public pressure, like because I will make every single gram of food and every food that I ate public when we publish this. So there's that pressure. Like I really can't. I mean, I guess I could, but I would be embarrassed. The other thing is I don't eat until the earliest I'll eat is about 11 o'clock in the morning, which I typically do that. Typically it's around 10, but I'll keep pushing that further and further, like 11 or 12. Today it was like even 1 o'clock before I had my first meal. So I'm not natural. So I know my body well enough to do the things that I can to help, but clearly eating cookies,
right?
Or what else do I have? Fruity Pebbles. Well, let's just see here. Okay. So that day I did have a fruit smoothie. I had oatmeal with a banana. I had rice with orange chicken, so the sauce is very high carbohydrate, and dinner Fruity Pebbles. So 4 cups of Fruity Pebbles, 2 cups of fat-free milk. So that day was about 2,100 calories, 81% carbs.
Wow.
It's not typically that high. But I had a meal with rice, a fruit smoothie, which was a ton of fruit. And let's see, protein 9.8%. I don't have the grams. Well, actually, do I have the grams? Yeah, 52 grams of protein that day. That's
wow.
nuts. So again, I'm hyper focused on carbs.
Yeah.
So whatever happened, but that's a fairly typical day. Again, not every day do I have Fruity Pebbles. Not every day do I have a fruit smoothie, but that's a good example of that. So yeah, hope to dispel that myth and not create another problem of people saying I can eat it all the crap I want.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, that's awesome. And then I guess, 10 weeks in it, is it working so far? Is there anything you can share there with that? Or would you like to, I mean, I understand if you need to wait to, you get finished and want to post it and everything like that.
Yeah, I don't really have much to say. I can say that I've lost weight. It's funny too. The other thing I'm doing is I'm getting a 4-compartment body composition model done on myself. So other than killing a human and literally cutting off their body fat and weighing it, the 4-compartment model is the gold standard. It's the closest you're ever going to get to knowing how much body fat is on your body. And the way that you do that is you have to get a DEXA, you have to have a bod pod, and you have to be able to measure your total body water. So you got to do those 3 things to get a 4-compartment model. And so I'm doing that. Again, I have my second one coming up this week. So in addition to this diet, I'm also testing 4 home-based or bathroom scales that also measure body fat percentage, because I want to test which one of them is the best. And one thing we have to appreciate is when you're trying to find a good or valid home scale, it's not just how accurate it is. So it's not just if I had a DEXA, let's say, and the DEXA said I'm 20% body fat, which scale gives me 20% body fat? That's important. I would say just as important, if not more important, is how good is that home scale on tracking losses of body fat? Because some scales will give you a good estimate at a given point in time, but they cannot detect losses or gains in body fat. And that's really what we need. So to me, that's more important. If it's always 2% off, as long as it's 2% lower, I don't really care. But can it detect losses of body fat? So that's the other thing that I'm doing with this. And I'm hoping to find a scale out of the 4 that I'm testing that I can recommend to people and even use in future research.
Awesome. Yeah, that's good to know on the body composition. So again, you have to get the 3. I think you said it was bod pod, DEXA, and the total body water,
which I'm using an InBody 570 to detect total body.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. That's good to know. I didn't know that you could get it accurate by doing those things. It's probably not very practical for a lot of people to get all 3 of those. You have to be somebody like yourself involved in the research, and I'm sure it's tough to get that. Last question on this: how long are you planning on doing this for?
The goal is to lose what most people would claim is a clinically significant amount of body weight. So 10% of my body weight. So I started at 230. I will not stop until I get to 207 pounds, which is 10% of my body weight. So that's quite a bit. I'm estimating this will take probably on at least 6 months, probably maybe up to 9 months is again what I'm estimating. But I have to be fair and open. Maybe eating all these carbs, maybe that's not ideal. All the previous research says it's fine, and I have my hypothesis, but I do have to at least, maybe it's not great for me. But so far, I've lost about 10 pounds, so I'm not quite halfway there yet. And I lost the weight that's the easiest to lose when you first start.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like, again, you're just kind of trying to show that, or at least see if, hey, it doesn't net like being in a calorie deficit, right? And just even if it is mostly carbs, like you could still lose weight. But like you said, this isn't necessarily a diet that you would like recommend to people. But, as a worst case scenario, it's like, hey, you still can do this if you want to, or again, if it's sustainable. Cause I think that's the other aspect of it, right? Too, is like, obviously food choice plays a big role in, how sustainable the calorie deficit is. So yeah, really looking forward to seeing, your results there on that. So, cool to see that I caught you when you were 10 weeks into it. Cause I know, like I said, last time we talked, you were kind of talking about it. And I think you talked about it on Steve Hall's podcast, Revive Stronger, I think was the other one I heard you chat about that with. So
Yeah, I think that's right. And maybe also on Mike Matthews' podcast,
yeah,
I mentioned it, but I don't know when I was on Steve's if I had started it yet.
I don't think you would have. That was a couple months ago. And I know Steve backlogs his podcast pretty good amount. So I would imagine you hadn't started it yet. So
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, this is probably my first like real conversation.
Awesome.
And one thing I help, sometimes I help people with diets. I don't have a business for that, but if I'm working right now, I'm working with somebody who's obese, and this is my first step. I'm like, we're not going to change anything about what you eat. Let's just find out what you eat, how much you eat. And now I just want you to eat less of that. So I think there's a mistake too in how a lot of people will coach clients, especially obese clients. They want to change 29 things. It's like, ooh, let's start with very simple steps to get them started. So what I'm doing is not even though I wouldn't recommend it, and I tell the people with obesity that I'm helping, how we're starting is not where we're going to be in 4 months or 6 months. Trust me, let's go with you just eat what you normally eat, and let's see how that's going to, eating less of that. And then let's, and what's awesome about that is as they start to see success, they start to come up with their own decisions on what they could exchange. And it's not even really me telling them, which I love that, because then it's more, I'm not a psychologist. What is that? It's like internally driven for them at that.
Yeah, once they kind of start coming up with things, it makes it easy. They feel like they're more a part of the process rather than you just kind of barking orders at them. But yeah, no, that's a good point you bring up too. Is again, in this case here, it's like you're not necessarily like changing all these foods out and going for the quote unquote diet foods. You're just eating less, and like you said, you're having Fruity Pebbles. I mean, that sounds like a freaking awesome day of food there that you had on Tuesday. So the enjoyment's there, absolutely. So yeah, I love that. That is a good point though that you bring up there with that. So cool. Is there any other insights or anything with that? Before we move on?
I don't think so. Yeah, surprisingly, my hunger, and I've always noticed this, the fear of hunger and dieting is always worse than the reality of, at least for me. It's always worse than the reality, hunger and dieting. I don't know why that is.
Yeah, no, I definitely can relate to that, where people, think that, the fear of it's worse than the actual hunger. But I also, I think it is important to, we talk about minimizing hunger, but I also think it's important to let people know that like, you just kind of have to accept that there's going to be some hunger when you lose weight or lose body fat. That's just going to be part of the process. I think too many people try to short circuit that or get around that. And it's like, you're just, it's just not going to happen. You're going to have to manage that at least a little bit or deal with it, So cool. Looking forward to seeing the results of that. And then, so since we've talked, I guess I just kind of wanted maybe to give the audience a brief little update on like the diet break research. Has there been anything in that time frame that's come out maybe since August? Have you had anything come out on your end, or is there any like new kind of research around that? I think there was something that came out sometime in the last 2 to 4 months around diet breaks.
Yeah, we published our study, or our study got published in, I think it might have been January of 2023. So not too many, not just within the last few months. That study we conducted going into COVID, and then I had a lot of delays, so we just got it published. So would you like me just to summarize what we found? So what we did, we had resistance trained females. So this was the first ever study looking at a resistance trained female only population, incorporating diet breaks into their fat loss program. So we had them, this was conducted at the University of South Florida. So they had to work out in my lab. So we were able to supervise all of their workouts. And we put 2 groups of people. One group was randomly assigned to the diet break group. The other group was assigned to what we would call the continuous dieting. The continuous dieting group dieted for 6 consecutive weeks. They never took a break. And we reduced their calories by 25% from their maintenance calorie. The diet break group also dieted for 6 weeks, but after the first 2 weeks, they took a 1 week diet break. And then after the second 2 weeks of dieting, so after 4 weeks of dieting, they took a second 1 week diet break. And then they finished with the final 2 weeks of dieting. So the time spent dieting was the same for both groups. And we looked at body composition and some psychological hunger variables as our outcome variables in the study. There was no differences in pretty much everything, but the body composition specifically, they maintained all of their lean mass. And that's not surprising because these subjects were resistance trained. One, they continued to resistance train. They weren't on an aggressive caloric deficit, and they had high protein. I think it was about 1.8 grams per kg of protein per kilogram of body mass. So we did everything that we know to maintain their muscle mass, and their metabolic rates were not suppressed at all. Both groups did lose a significant amount of body fat with this caloric deficit, but the diet break group offered no advantage relative to either maintaining or gaining muscle mass. It offered no advantage relative to losing body fat. And you can look at that a couple ways, which I think a lot of people look at that and they say, well, diet breaks are worthless. Why would we do them? And I think that is a naive way to look at this research literature. So let's talk for a minute about, well, why didn't they lose more body fat, or why weren't they able to help with, why weren't they any different than the other group? And essentially, I think this is the reason. If a diet break is going to be instituted, there needs to be something that a diet break is fixing, for lack of a better word. A diet break is going to help prevent some damage or some negative side effects of diet. In our study, we didn't have any negative adaptations. Again, they kept their muscle mass, they kept their metabolic rate. If we have, and I think the research, the limited research on diet breaks would support this. If the diets are much more aggressive, or if they're a much longer period of time, such that muscle mass would be lost, such that metabolic rate would be suppressed, there's where diet breaks would have a greater utility to be effective. So in our study, it needed to be longer or more aggressive to give a diet break an opportunity to have some benefits. Now, I can also admit it might just not be helpful. And again, that's effectively what we said. In this population, not working out, not dieting aggressively, not having a long duration, a diet break wasn't effective relative to metabolism and body. The other area that we looked at where there was a significant difference between the two groups, and this was the only difference, was in the psychological hunger variable. So we surveyed them. We used something called the eating inventory, which looks at 3 domains of hunger. One of them is called disinhibition. And disinhibition is where somebody has the subjective feeling of being out of control. They are much more likely to overeat in a stressful situation or in a situation where they have access to highly palatable foods. So what you want with disinhibition, you want that score to go down over time, because that means that you are in more control of your eating. And what we found was a divergent response. The diet break group did have a reduction in their disinhibition scores. So they were less likely to overeat when stressed, less likely to overeat when in the presence of highly palatable foods. Whereas the continuous dieting group, it increased over time. And if you think, well, why might that be? The hypothesis is the diet break group was able to indulge in some foods and take breaks from dieting during their 8-week intervention. The other group had to keep resisting foods. They didn't get a break. So the longer you suppress this urge to eat more foods, or possibly your favorite foods, the more internally you start to have this creeping of, I want this. So we can even call it diet fatigue. So I look at that, and my hypothesis is, if they were to continue to diet, I think we would have seen a significant improvement in adherence with the diet breaks compared to the other group that had to continually eat in a caloric deficit. And I'll just add, another study published a year prior from Australia, they didn't look at disinhibition, but they looked at hunger and the drive to eat, and they they reported the same thing. Those two hunger variables, they were less hungry, essentially, in the subjects that were allowed to have diet breaks or that had prescribed diet breaks versus the other group that did not. So 2 studies, both in resistance trained populations, both reported statistically significant psychological improvements related to food and hunger.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think so my understanding of the research on diet breaks, at least where we're at now, is that, again, it's like from a physiological standpoint, probably not going to get an increase in like fat loss. I think that was kind of what some people thought might happen, but as you guys have kind of dove into the research more, it's like that's not happening. But where you're really seeing that big benefit is from the, like you said, the psychological side of things, where, you know, people's hunger levels are lower, their disinhibition is in a better spot. It's lower, right? Disinhibition's lower in the right. And again, and like you said there, that's more of like the one you did was more of a short-term study. So it's like, you know, what's going to show up there in the longer term, you know, how big of a difference is that going to make? Because I would imagine, like you said, as they go on longer and longer, it's like that stuff's going to start to pop up. So is that kind of, I guess, is that where the research is at now with the diet breaks? And is there anything else that like, where else do you kind of see the research like going here with diet breaks?
Well, I think, and I'll reiterate, if a diet break is going to have the potential to be better than a non-diet break approach physiologically, you're going to have a diet that's going to induce some damage, that's going to induce some negative adaptations, because otherwise, again, there's no utility for a diet break to work. So until we have those studies, and we did have that with the Matador study in obese males, their diet breaks they caused more fat loss. They caused significantly more fat body weight losses, much longer study duration. It was 16 weeks of dieting or 31-week diet break intervention. So there we've seen it. And I just think on 2 fronts, from a lifestyle perspective, most people don't want to diet week after week, month after month. They're going to have birthday parties, or they're going to want to have vacation. They're going to have diet fatigue. And I don't think we should say every 8 weeks we're doing a diet break. No. When are you starting to struggle? When does your adherence start to wane and start to decrease? Well, now that's something that we could consider. And then we look at physique athletes who are dieting to extremely low levels of body fat. In my conversations with coaches, they love diet breaks if they have the ability, because a physique athlete has a specific date when they have to step on stage. But whenever they can, assuming that they're lean enough to afford them the opportunity to include diet breaks, the coaches that I speak to, despite my own research, which says it's not effective, they say, no, these are highly effective in helping us lose more body fat or maintain muscle mass. And I would also suggest this relative to muscle mass. When you do a diet break, yes, you're no longer dieting. So the stimulus on fat loss is reduced, but now you're no longer in a catabolic state or catabolic environment. So by virtue of that, you do have the opportunity, 1, to prevent the loss of lean tissue, and 2, potentially increase lean tissue during those diet breaks.
Yeah, I just had, and I'm sure you're familiar with him, Dr. Peter Fitchin on the podcast last week, and we just kind of talked about his contest prep, and he said this time around, he implemented more regular diet breaks, and he said his prep was easier, and he said that, you know, he felt like he just maintained more muscle, you know, in the process as well too. And he mentioned training was a little bit different, but, you know, again, I was like, well, it sounds like that's exactly what the research shows on the diet breaks, is that, you know, again, it helped him stick with it. It made it easier, but also, like you said, the maintenance of lean body mass, which, you know, I think is super important in the weight loss process. I think people overlook that aspect of it too often, you know, in terms of maintaining lean body mass. So again, you mentioned you talk to coaches too. So, and for myself, you know, I like to implement it with clients, like you mentioned, like a vacation, or if they're having stressful weeks, like that's been super helpful to implement these diet breaks during that period of time. And I think a lot of people just don't realize that they can do those things, right? Like you take somebody who doesn't have as much knowledge about, you know, the research on diet breaks. I don't think people think that they can do that, right? They think it's this one shot. They just have to get to their body weight, and that, you know, they got to get it down in one shot, and they don't think about implementing these things.
Yeah. And I think there's a real diet fatigue that manifests. Well, the research would suggest after 6 months of continuous dieting, this is all coming from the obesity research. After 6 months, if you look at almost any study that's a year long, in individuals with obesity, you're going to see almost the same thing in every single study. And that is the lowest body weight will occur at about 6 months. And then from the 6th month to the 12th month, you'll start to see a rebound. There's one of 2 things happening there. It's either metabolic adaptation, or they're not adhering to the diet. And based on mathematical modeling research, the latter, it's the fact that they are not adhering. Now, there could be metabolic adaptation, but it's very hard to demonstrate in the research. Again, I don't think you will find that in the research literature. And I've even changed my thinking on this. If I'm working with a general population or somebody with obesity, I'm going to make sure that I'm not going to assume metabolic adaptation. I'm going to start with making sure, are you adhering to our plan? If they are, okay, now we can give some attention to metabolic adaptation. But back to where diet breaks help with this, I think it immensely helps with adherence the longer and longer a diet goes. And when you do that, that actually manifests fat loss.
Yeah, the adherence aspect of it is so important. And like you said, people, blame it. They think it's metabolic adaptation or something, but it's like you said, the longer you diet, it just becomes tougher and tougher to stick with it. And there's just, especially in today's environment, there's just so many things pulling you away from that. And, in today's world, whatever you have to eat in order to lose weight, 18, 2000, like that can get up, that you can, those 1,800, 2,000 calories can go pretty quickly, depending on your food choice too. So I know in the research, I think it sounds like most of the diet breaks are like 1 to 2 weeks. Could you also kind of have like a diet break be something that's longer than like 1 to 2 weeks as well too? I'm sure there's not any downside to that. Like it could be, I'm sure it could be as long as you wanted it to be, but I just didn't know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm not aware of, well, actually I am aware of one study, the Wing and Jeffrey study. I call that the original diet break study. They did have a 6-week break of the diet, and they also had 3 2-week breaks of the diet. And that was no different than the 6-week break was just as effective as 3 shorter 2-week breaks. And that was just as effective as a 20-week caloric deficit. So yeah, they can be longer. Other than that study, I'm not aware of any research to demonstrate that. But at that point, when they start getting longer, you have I think we then have to admit, diet, fat loss is slow generally, but now we're saying it's going to take longer. But I actually like the idea of, let's diet for a month. Let's take a month off. Let's diet for a month. Let's see, do you have the skill set to maintain your fat loss? Because some people don't have that. I struggle with that. I'm a much better dieter and I'm a much better weight gainer than I am a maintainer. So I look in the mirror when I say that. So that's one thing I like to challenge people that I help. Let's demonstrate that you can master, or at least demonstrate the skill set of maintaining, because we can't diet, or we can, but I refuse to allow you to diet for 12 straight months. It's just not going to happen. Go to somebody else if that's what you want to do, because I do know the research on what that looks like on the back end, and it's ugly.
Right. Yeah. And unfortunately, most people, they don't want to implement these things, so they just want to get to that goal weight as soon as they can. But, like you said, that's an uphill battle, and it's tough. And like you said, it looks ugly on the back end. So last question here on the diet break stuff. So is there any, I guess maybe is there any like mistakes, or do you see anybody like kind of misapply this, from like coaches? Like, do you see anybody misapply the diet break research or anything like that? Or is there any like mistakes you see people make with diet breaks?
I don't know if I see mistakes. I would say it's something that's very tempting to do to somebody who's a little too dialed into the research and not enough in the real world would be, hey, Dr. Campbell did a diet break after 2 weeks of dieting. The Matador study, they did 2 weeks of dieting, then a 2-week diet break. I would never plan, unless it's a vacation, but I would never plan ahead of time when you should institute a diet break. Rather, I would base that on the biofeedback of the client, because if they're humming along and they're motivated to diet and they're losing body fat, why would I want to change that? If things are hopping and they're not having any diet fatigue, let them keep dieting. At the same time, when the weight starts to plateau, the weight loss, the fat loss starts to plateau, or they say, hey, if they're honest, I'm really wanting to do this or this with my diet, I know I can't. I'm like, okay, well, that tells me this would be a time to institute a diet break. And remember, diet breaks, I'm not remember, I know you know this, but a message to tell people is a diet break is not what I like to call a food order. It is still, you still have to resist, or you still have to have a cap on your calories. So there is still a limit on what you can eat. It's just that the limit is theoretically your maintenance calories. So you really shouldn't gain actual body fat. You may gain a little bit of body water, maybe trivial amounts of body fat, but it is trivial if at all. Some people lose body weight when they're on a diet break.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's the common, like, that's the biggest mistake I see people make, is they hear that diet break, and like you said, now they think it's like, I like your the food orgy. I love that. It's obviously not that. Like, you still need to make sure you're, moderating and things like that. And also, like you said too, it sounds like, some people can potentially, and I've seen this happen, some people do drop some body weight, and that's probably just from like lowering their stress levels, or something's going on there. But yeah, so that's super cool. Is there anything is there any research coming up with diet breaks that you're aware of, or anything like that?
Not that I'm aware of. I will say an area that I'm really interested in is like progressive diets, where you start the diet much more aggressive, and then over time increase the calories. So it's a form of nonlinear dieting, just like diet breaks would be. But that area is something that's very intriguing to me, and I wouldn't be surprised if my lab something in that area in the year or two.
Awesome. Yeah. So basically, you start out with a higher deficit, and then as the fat loss phase goes on, you're kind of increasing the calories and potentially getting rid of that diet fatigue in that way as well too. So cool. Yeah, that would be awesome to kind of see some research around that. So awesome. Good little summary there of diet breaks. Just kind of wanted to do a state of the union for diet breaks and see where we were at there with that. So I did have a couple other topics. I'm sure we'll probably only get to one of these, but you still have, just so everyone knows, you have your Body by Science, where I think you research about three articles per month or something like that in your research review. And so I just wanted to hop on here and talk about a couple topics. I know one of them that you recently talked about in your April issue was calorie tracking for fat loss. I thought this would be a good topic to dive into. So yeah, let's kind of talk about that study that you talked about in your research review, Body by Science, on calorie tracking. So, I guess maybe start off by why you chose this one, why it was interesting, and then kind of some of the findings there around it.
Yeah, so that study focused on using like a macro tracking app, and how that can be used in a fat loss plan or a diet. So that immediately jumped out to me, and I'm trying to remember when it was published. So in my Body by Science, I don't always do the most recent research studies. I also try to get the landmark studies, and some of them could be 30 years old, but the studies that I include like that are the studies that have really charted what we think about fat loss or building muscle today. So it's not just the most recent research, it's also the historical most impactful research. And I think this was one of those studies. I'm trying to remember when it was published.
2020.
Okay. So yeah, so not that old, but definitely not not a 2023 study. So because so many people are now using apps to track their calories, the study immediately jumped out to me when I first saw it. I'm like, okay. And more importantly than the apps, again, that was a given. They're going to use these apps. But what the researchers were wanting to do was to ask the question, how often or how important is consistently using your app to lose body? So this, I always have to, because I kind of serve two different populations: physique athletes, bodybuilders, bikini competitors, wellness competitors, and then the general population who wants to lose body fat, not for the purpose of stepping on a bodybuilding stage, but just to be healthier or to look leaner, to not have as much excess body fat. So this study would focus not on the competitors, but more on the general population individual who might have 10 or 20 pounds of body fat to lose. So what they did was they gave all of these people with overweight or obesity, they set them up on a macro tracking app, educated them how to do it. And essentially they said, okay, let's just track you. How much body fat are you losing over time? And what they found was the longer and longer somebody goes on a diet, the less and less adherent they are to using the app to using the macro tracking app. And let's state that for what it is. The longer you go on a diet, the less you are following that diet. And again, I am really hyper focused lately on, if we work with non-bodybuilding client, we have to be focused on adherence. Know that they're going to struggle following the diet. Bodybuilders, not so much. They're going to pretty much do what you tell them to do. And again, very different population. So what they did more specifically was they defined a consistent tracker as somebody who monitored their body weight 6 out of 7 days per week. And I think also the monitoring their total calorie intake, also 6 out of 7 days per week, 75% of the time. So not even a really high threshold. I mean, when I use my macro app, I mean, do it every single day, especially when I'm in a case study like now. Now, I do go for periods of time where I don't use it, and guess what? I gain a lot of fat. That's just me. So what they found was not surprising, but the participants who lost significantly more body weight were the consistent trackers. Those that struggled to lose as much body fat were inconsistent trackers of their calories and their body weight. So they had them track both of them over a period of time. And then there was also in that issue, I did a little summary figure of like the first month, it was like out of all, I think it was 100 subjects, like 70% of them followed it very highly. And then you just look at each month after that, the percentage of people that use the app consistently down. And by like 6 months, it was not good. So again, I want to say this for those of us helping people with weight loss, and we need fitness professionals to help people with weight loss. The health data is not good. And now for the first time in this, I call it the age of idiocy, we're having to battle messages of it's okay to be obese, fine. And it just goes against every research study that looks at what happens to your body with excess adiposity. And sure, there is the rare person who is metabolically healthy at this time who may be obese, but would that be the case in 5 or 10 years? And again, I think you can appreciate this is not a shaming exercise. This is showing empathy and compassion to people who need to lose body fat. And I think one of the ways that we need to do that is to focus on people's inability to adhere to the diets. And this study just kind of highlighted that with the tool of an app to demonstrate it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of good things to take from this, right? Like you said, it obviously shows that, you know, the consistency of it is just adherence and consistency is the most important, but also, like you said, you know, I'm looking at this graph right now, like you said, 70% in the first week we're tracking. And then by week 8, it was down to 20%, which is pretty crazy, of people who were tracking consistently. And like you said, consistently wasn't like it was 100% of the time either. It was also, I think you said 6 out of 7 days, or like 75% or something like that. So pretty crazy to think there with that. So, and it looks like the amount that they lost was pretty substantial. It's not like it was, I think it was 4 pounds on average for the inconsistent, and then I think up to 10 on the other group. So pretty good amount there. So, and again, this I think also goes to show, you know, like we just talked about the importance of adherence and implementing diet breaks, and how it's probably more an adherence issue than it is like metabolic adaptation or something like that. So I guess for this, you know, you kind of left the question of like, what are some like strategies that you let people do to kind of help people like track this? Like, is there anything that you found that people said was helpful to, you know, get people to track a little bit more consistently, or anything like that? Or,
well, my thinking, and again, I'm not a coach, so I'm not highly skilled in helping people with tracking, but I do have my own life, and I come from a family of obesity. I've been obese. Again, I'm probably obese now clinically. So one thing that the research is telling me is that there is a real thing of diet fatigue. So the longer somebody goes, and as you just looked at the graph, even there, week 1 to week 8 to week 12, less and less people are doing the skill of tracking their body weight and calories. And this goes back to our first to our first topic. Wouldn't a diet break? Well, we know that a diet break helps with hunger, even though you may think, well, no, that opens up Pandora's box and now I can't stop. Although the research doesn't support that at all. Research says no. Diet breaks help with hunger. And I believe, as I think anybody using intuitive logic would suggest, if you're less hungry, it's easier to stick to the diet. So there's the first thing. When do you need to when would you need to suggest a diet break for your client? And that could be a weight loss plateau. And again, for the population that we're referring to, a weight loss plateau is most likely an adherence. It's not because their metabolism has slowed down. And I've changed my thinking on that. I was very quick to assume, oh, your metabolism's slowing down. Let's use a diet break. I still would suggest a diet break, but not because of metabolism slowing down, because I don't think that they would be following the diet for week after, as the duration goes on. So there's the one thing. I'm trying to think too, and I don't have this in front of me, but I do have expert contributors that apply this. And that's where I do get, hey, what do you do to help people adhere? And I wish I could remember. I do know that one of my experts in that issue, Andres Vargas, who happens to be a former student of mine, he uses a habit tracker as part of his coaching service. And I remember emailing him after I read that. I'm like, what is this? Like, that seems awesome. And I can't remember exactly what he said, but just the idea of just helping people get into the habit of whatever it is that they're struggling with. Using it might have been another app, or it might have been something he created, but a habit tracker. So maybe that would be to help people adhere. Maybe that's, hey, let's not be so focused on food. Let's make sure we're getting our steps in for the next 30 days. And one thing I learned over the last year or two on physical activity is it is powerful in terms of regulating your appetite. I never appreciated that before. So, and that's mostly aerobic exercise. So what I've learned was, if you're regularly doing aerobic exercise, and the same may be true with resistance exercise, we just don't have data to rely on. It does two things. It helps you to stop eating when you're full. So we would call that, it helps with satiation, and it helps with satiety, which means that you're not hungry after you're done eating. So let me just repeat that. If you can help people to engage in exercise, at this point, let's just say aerobic exercise, they stop eating when they're full. So they're putting down their meal, their forks earlier, and they're not hungry between meals. Now, they do have a healthy hunger. Hunger actually goes up with this research or with aerobic exercise. But again, it's regulated hunger. You're hungry when you need to eat, but you stop eating when you're full, and you're not hungry after eating. So it sounds a little contradictory. Let me just summarize all of that. Another strategy, you asked for strategies, is make sure that you are encouraging some type of aerobic activity with people that seem to be struggling with adherence, because it helps regulate hunger.
Yeah, no, a ton of great points in there. I like the habit tracking. I also like implementing diet breaks, and maybe even like you said, potentially implementing something where you just maybe take a break from tracking for a little bit during that diet break and just maintain habits, during that time to kind of help take some of that off. Because I think, again, with tracking, a lot of people think if they start tracking, it's like one of those things they have to do forever. And it's like, it doesn't have to be something that you do forever. You can learn how to do it, take a break, or you can take a break forever, right? Like, you have these options there. You don't have to do tracking all the time. So I think implementing something like that can be helpful. But I like the movement too. I mean, movement is so powerful. And I think people often overlook how powerful it can be, especially in weight maintenance, I think as well too. What do you think is the kind of the power of, moving that helps people regulate their appetite better?
Boy, that's a good question. And I'm going to say that, pleading ignorance. There is so, and again, it's not because I didn't try. There is a lot that we don't know about appetite regulation.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing that I learned when I was trying to do this research on physical activity and hunger regulation or appetite regulation. There's so much we don't know. Some of it is at least theorized that it's neurological, and that's probably where a lot of this research lies. But yeah, I'm at a loss as to get into mechanisms, as I think so are the people that do the research.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's super interesting to hear that, that it does play such a big role there with that. So, well, cool, Bill. Well, we're coming up here at the top of the hour. So I guess before I let you go, is there any studies on your end that's going to be coming out soon that, you can maybe tease the audience with?
Yeah, my research team right now, and my research coordinator, Corey LaFontaine, he's kind of leading this for my research team. He's graduating, and actually he graduated yesterday, but fortunately I have him for another few months before he goes to get his PhD. But we are doing a systematic review and meta-analysis on concurrent training. So what we're doing is we're comparing aerobic exercise alone versus resistance training alone. And then, of course, concurrent means you're combining them. And we're doing something unique with this. We are focused on body fat loss. So essentially, let me phrase it differently. What's better for fat loss, aerobic exercise or resistance? We're going to answer that question. And we're also saying, okay, when you combine the two, what's the outcome there? And obviously the outcome predictably would be more fat loss because you're burning more calories. But nobody has ever compared those two, resistance versus aerobic, in studies that had both groups. So we're only including studies that had an aerobic training program and a resistance training program within the same study. So a lot of that research now is you're borrowing from studies that had no intention of trying to lose body fat, or that even had a resistance training component or an aerobic training component. So what we're doing that I think is unique is we're getting only the relevant studies that can answer that question. And I think what we're going to find, and I have no idea because we haven't analyzed it yet, we're still in the process of doing our article retrieval. I think we're going to find that aerobic exercise is better for fat loss in the short term because these studies are 12 weeks, 8 weeks, maybe 6 months. I would suggest that if you're trying to change your resistance exercises, in my professional opinion, that's probably a better mode of exercise. But if somebody says, I want to lose fat now, I'm hypothesizing that our data would say, well, aerobic exercise is probably the better mode in the immediate term for that purpose. But I could be surprised and not. So maybe next time you have me on, well, I can actually tell you what we found.
Yeah, awesome. And from my understanding, the research around concurrent trainings mostly like to see what the adaptations are of like hypertrophy and like strength, right? So this is a little bit, that's where this study is going to differ from like the other concurrent training studies.
Exactly. Yes. There have been, I think we're aware of 4 systematic reviews and meta-analyses on concurrent training, and they're all focused on muscle hypertrophy or an interference effect of aerobic exercise on the resistance training adaptation. So rather than do a 5th, we led into, okay, well, what happens to body fat levels? Because nobody's done that yet.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Because you do always kind of hear that talk of like, oh, should I lift weights? Should I do, so I think that's going to answer, that will help at least expand that knowledge there around that and give people better answers around that topic. But like you said, obviously still going to recommend resistance training, but yeah, well, cool. That's awesome. Yeah, we'll look forward to that. And I know you're always putting out more and more research, so appreciate all the work you do. But last question before you leave, is there anywhere where you would like to leave the audience to find you and I guess probably talk about Body by Science and things like that?
Yeah, so I have this research review, which thank you again for letting me talk about it. If you go to billcampbellphd.com, that's my website, you can download an issue for free so you can see what it looks like. What I do in this is every month I summarize 2 recent or historically relevant research studies that are solely focused on fat loss or building muscle. And then I also bring in expert contributors like yourself, that you're coaches that work with clients to say, okay, Dr. Campbell, you reviewed the science. Here's how I take that and apply it in my coaching practice. And I think that's the most valuable aspect of it. So that's, if you go to my website, billcampbellphd.com, or if you DM me on Instagram, my Instagram is Bill Campbell PhD. If you DM me, I'll send you the link to get an issue for free to see if it's something that you would find valuable.
Awesome. Yeah, I know that it's pretty cool how you add in the people in the field, in the trenches doing it, because that is important too, right? Breaking down the study, but then also, hey, this is how people apply it, because that is important as well too. So awesome. Yeah, we'll make sure that's in the show notes. Dr. Campbell, thank you again for coming on. As always, a ton of great information, and we will talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you.